the hardest issue that I see coming in is people that have been married or together for a really long time that have slowly kind of drifted apart. And maybe they stopped talking about their issues at some point, or maybe they've been sweeping stuff under the rug. But those are the times that I think it's the most difficult because there's so much hurt there to unpack.
Hello, hello, Juliana. Welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me.
I'm so excited to have you here today because relationships are such a fun topic to me. I actually used to be a matchmaker in New York City. I don't think many people know that.
Good job.
Oh my gosh, it was such a great job. I had the best time. And I learned a lot about relationships and couples through the lens of almost dating during that time. But I know today we're going to be diving into the habits of healthy and successful couples. And you are a marriage and family therapist. So I figured you'd be the right person to have on the show. So thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thanks again. And that's kind of my bread and butter. I love talking about relationships. So I have a lot to say.
Fabulous. So let's just go right into it. What made you want to become a marriage and family therapist in the first place?
Yeah. So I've always known I wanted to be a therapist, or not always, since high school, pretty early, because I was always interested in psychology. That actually wasn't offered as a class at my high school, so it made me even more interested in it. But later on, I didn't really want to go into couples therapy. That wasn't the goal. I wanted to do one-on-one sort of stuff. But as I got into my master's program and started actually seeing clients, I realized I really like having more than one person in the room. It's less introspective and more like everything's happening externally. It's based on communication and relationships and all of these things rather than, your relationship to yourself, which is how I view individual therapy. So, yeah, I like how fast paced it is. It is a bit more difficult, some people would say, but for me, I just love being in it.
Wow. So that's an interesting way to think about it. So, as a therapist, the one on one scenario, it's very introspective, internal reflection based. And then as a couples therapist, you are observing the dynamic externally between the couples. And what would you say makes that more difficult in some ways? I know some people would argue it's not, but
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like who you ask, you get a different answer. But I think, especially families, because then there's even more people in the room. But with couples, sometimes they get dragged into the cycle while they're talking about the issue. And then that can be really hard to manage sometimes. But I think it's super common, when you're talking about, I guess you could say, triggering issues, you're likely to go back into the way that you usually talk about them at home. So that can be difficult, but it's also good for me to kind of learn more information about how they're approaching whatever the issue is.
wow. So when you say the cycle, let's explain to the listeners a little bit about what you mean by that. Some might not know.
Yeah. So I'm a systemic therapist, which means I kind of view everything in terms of that cycle. I think people, whether it be individuals or couples, come into therapy because they've been feeling stuck. And the way I look at it, it's because they're stuck in the cycle or pattern of interaction between themselves and their partner, or, themselves. So my work is in identifying what that negative cycle is, and then trying to have them find a different way of interacting with each other so that they're not feeling so stuck.
Mm, that's so interesting. As someone who's been in couples therapy before, it's you can feel yourself getting pulled into the cycle sometimes and having the conversation about the topics that you're struggling with and then getting pulled into that pattern of interacting. And I could imagine that in your role, you're kind of like a fly on the wall, like even though there might be this display or a clash or conflict happening between them, you're at least observing so much. Like, what are you looking for in those moments when people are totally dragged into their pattern?
Yeah. Well, sometimes it's not helpful for them to stay in that for too long because it can become destructive. But I think it's important for me to see, like, what does this communication look like when they're at home? Not saying it's going to look the same in my office, but I think when they, like you're saying, when they kind of get sucked in is when you start to see a little bit more of this is what the cycle actually looks like from an objective point of view versus like how each member is describing it.
Got it. Okay. So you get to see it in real time in a way, as opposed to just that verbal account that some people show up to therapy with, which is actually really interesting because that reminds me of when I do my work with eating disorder recovery clients. And I hear them talk about their relationship with food, right? And how they interact with a meal. But then when we actually sit and eat together, I'm observing all these new layers that have not been described or explained in the verbal one-on-one setting where we're just talking about it and they're explaining what's happening. So very interesting. So, okay. So what are some of the most common reasons couples find themselves in your office?
It could be a variety of things, but I would say the most common things that I see are, one member is struggling with addiction or alcoholism. There's been like an infidelity that's happened. So some sort of breach of trust that has led to, it kind of reaching a peak for them to reach couples therapy. But it could also be just like they feel like they're missing each other, like they're not feeling as close as they used to be. Another really common like area of life or like point of life that I see couples coming in is when they become empty nesters. Because once the kids are out of the home, you kind of have to learn how to be with your partner in a way. It's like relearning each other over time. I mean, it could really be anything. And there are things that couples have come in for that I've only seen like once, but I would say that those are kind of the main themes.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Would you say like, I guess it's hard to say, but what has been like one of the most difficult cases that you've seen come into your office?
That's a hard question. Depends on what you mean by difficult,
Mhm.
because the first thing that came to my mind is like difficult in terms of kind of like we were talking earlier, like them being in the cycle in the room and not being able to get work done because they keep going back to that place. But then there's like the kind of difficult that comes with, they're just at an impasse and, maybe their values have changed over time and they're like different people now. But I would say like the hardest like issue that I see coming in is people that have been married or together for a really long time that have slowly kind of drifted apart. And maybe they stopped talking about their issues at some point, or maybe they've been sweeping stuff under the rug. But those are the times that I think it's the most difficult because there's so much hurt there to unpack.
Wow. Okay. So that's so fascinating, actually. So it's the couple, a lot of the times, not all the time, but a lot of the times, couples that have been together for a really long time and they've kind of grown apart. And you use the word impasse, which is really interesting to me. And it made me think, do you ever get to the moment where you see couples who have changed so much that they are no longer compatible?
Yeah. Yeah. I've seen that several times. And I know that's scary, but I think, one of the questions that you gave me was about success. And I think that that's kind of difficult to categorize in couples therapy because sometimes they don't reach the goal that they've set, but it's the right thing for them to separate, or it's the right thing for them to, you know, spend some time apart or whatever. So, yeah, I mean, I think people can change so much over the course of like several years that maybe it's like a different person than you originally got together with.
Yeah, I could totally see that. I know someone who in the pandemic, there was so much tension politically during the pandemic. The values between the partners just became so drastically different in how they saw the world, that that was the thing that they ended their relationship on, was this big mismatch in values and perspective of the world, where they had 20 years of marriage fairly successfully leading up to that, but they were at an impasse. So you bring up the word success, and I am curious. So you mentioned it's really hard to define, but what would you say, like, what's a successful outcome? I guess even a breakup could be a successful outcome in your eyes, like if they're better off without the relationship, right? But I guess how would you just define a successful relationship, or just like a healthy one?
Yeah, so defining success like through, I guess, my side, like my lens as a therapist would be, you write a treatment plan and you ask each member of the couple and, kind of come up to what is their main goal in being in therapy? Like, what do they want to accomplish? And my work is in trying to accomplish that goal with them. So I guess success could look like them accomplishing that goal, or if there's other goals that come up that they want to add to that. But otherwise, I think just kind of finding out what is the best path forward for them. Because, like I said, sometimes that can look like, maybe they're not happy together anymore and need to separate. But sometimes maybe there are different things that they could do in their communication or as a couple to bring them closer. Because I think, Esther Perel says like infidelity in particular can be such a groundbreaking thing in a couple relationship. Like it can tear couples apart and it can bring them really close together. It's kind of like, I think of it like a building that gets demolished, like the foundation, like you're way back to the foundation. So you have the opportunity to rebuild or, walk away. And I think that's up to the clients and what they decide.
Wow, that is an extreme example. Infidelity. When I think of it, maybe it's just the way I view the world. Like, how can people come back from that? Like, you find that it can bring people closer from what you've just shared.
Yeah, I think infidelity is kind of like a symptom sometimes rather than the problem itself. Like, I think some people seek that. And I hesitate to say that because I know that that kind of leads to the misinterpretation that it's the other person's fault, like they weren't doing enough, which I totally disagree with. But like I was saying, like looking at it through the lens of the cycle, maybe they've been growing apart and don't feel as close or don't feel like they can talk about these things. And then that can lead to an emotional affair or, seeking that out from other people. And so, really, what it does is it kind of shines a light on what's really going on in the relationship and how can we move forward and fix it.
Got it. So that couple's goal might be to increase emotional connection again, or whatever turned them towards like seeking someone else out.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Okay. So as far as the outcomes of like a successful relationship go, do you have any common themes of like what these goals are that people are coming to you with?
I would say success is less about the goals and more about the way that the couple approaches it. Like it could be like the goal could be whatever, but as long as they're like both engaged and willing to make that change or whatever changes, as long as they're willing to express what their needs are and kind of set aside, and this is something that we can work on in couples therapy too, but set aside like those reactive emotions that come up and like get to the root of it and be able to talk about it and do the work outside of session. Those are the things that I think lend to success the most.
Oh, wow. Okay. So it's not necessarily achieving the original goal you set, it's about how you approach getting there and the enthusiasm and the commitment that you bring to the table with your partner.
Yeah. Yeah, I think therapy is more like an art than a science. Like it can be the same treatment issue and kind of the same themes, but it can go so differently each time. And I think, you know, like I said, it's more about the process than where you end up.
Okay. That makes so much sense. And I love thinking about that because I think no matter what situation you're in, you're going to find some hope in the sense that, okay, this relationship has gotten very bad. Maybe there has been fidelity. Maybe, bad things have happened. But if I'm showing up for this and I'm engaged and I can see my partner is engaged, we might actually have hope here.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's absolutely.
So at what point do you ever see like it's a lost cause? Like how do people show up?
Well, I that's really tricky too because you never know. Relationships are really complicated, but the things that I'm looking out for that can be red flags are what John and Julie Gottman called like the Four Horsemen. And basically, what those are four different things that tend to come up in relationships that they, through studies, have found out can be predictors to divorce or breakups. And basically, what those look like are criticism, defensiveness, basically any time that you're like turning against your partner instead of turning towards them, contempt, stonewalling, which is where you're like shutting down and not discussing things anymore. Maybe you get too overwhelmed. But those sorts of things are always red flags to me. And also, like the way that people can, you know, sometimes call each other names or like maybe there's yelling. I think it's really important that a couple sees each other as a team against an issue rather than against each other.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, I've heard of the Gottman Four Horsemen before and man, those are tough to get past if you're in that situation. But I love how you also recognize that, you know, the success comes with being a team. And I find those horsemen kind of go against that, right? It's like at some point, if you're being defensive, if you're being critical, if you're stonewalling, the sense of being a team has dissolved. And it's more, instead of us together, it's me versus you. And there's more, like you said, I don't know. I guess it has like more of a finger pointing energy and a blaming energy than being together as a whole.
Right, exactly. And, there are like the antidotes to these four horsemen, like things that you can do to combat them, which is one of them is soft startup. So, like the way that you approach an issue is really important. If you're coming in like already angry, it's probably going to go that way. But if you come in calm and choosing your words carefully, that can help. Being sure to like self regulate your emotions, especially like in these difficult conversations. I think it's better to take breaks than it is to like continue to escalate sometimes, as long as you're coming back to it later.
Absolutely. I love this. So we have some antidotes here: soft startup, taking breaks. What else is there?
Yeah, so it's building a culture of appreciation. So, like having appreciation and gratitude for your partner are really important, but also making sure that you're prioritizing the relationship. Like that comes first. That's not one of the horsemen, but I think that's also something to think about.
That is your straight up advice that you've
Right,
seen. That's good. That's good. You invented that one.
right.
That's great. Prioritizing the relationship seems so important. Many of us center our lives around our relationships. And if someone else is putting it on the back burner or shoving it to the bottom of the to do list, it feels horrible.
Yeah. And it can be really hard to do that sometimes when there's a lot going on. Like people's lives are busy. Just making sure that's on your mind as often as it can be.
Hmm. Hmm. Okay. So, did you have any other antidotes in there? I assume there'd be four because there are four horsemen, but maybe I'm wrong.
The last one is basically taking responsibility. So instead of becoming defensive, taking accountability and being able to name what it is that, like, what part that you've played in it, which can be a really difficult one because, like you said, it can go into like the finger pointing and like, well, here's what you did. But I think being able to take a step back and say, yeah, I did this, and then that invites your partner to also do that. That's just an avenue towards connection.
Mm. I heard this quote yesterday about mistakes and ownership, taking responsibility. And the woman was saying it's important to own your mistakes because then they have less power over you in general. Instead of pushing it away, ignoring it, dumping it on someone else, it's almost a little bit less scary if you can just own up to your side of whatever situation you and your partner are going through. And your partner's probably going to feel good knowing that you can see how you might be contributing to the issue.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, taking responsibility for your part doesn't invalidate the hurt you feel that maybe your partner has done things against you. It's just saying, like, yeah, this was my part in it. And I acknowledge that. And like I said, that opens the door for your partner to do the same.
Would you say some people struggle with ownership of their mistakes because there's like this feeling that it invalidates their partner's mistakes?
Yeah,
Takes
definitely.
away, you see that sometimes?
Yeah, I mean, like, kind of going back to the cycle again, like each person in the couple has a part to play in it. And so it's difficult when you're feeling hurt by what your partner has done to say, yeah, maybe I had a part in this too.
Mm.
That could
Mhm.
be tough for people.
That makes a lot of sense. So I love that. Okay, so those are the 4 antidotes. What about in general, when you see healthy couples out in the world, what's our working definition of a healthy couple?
They have good communication. They talk about issues as they come up and realize that they might not always fully agree on things, but they're willing to compromise. I think being able to break those patterns, first of all, acknowledge them, because I think that can be really dangerous, just not acknowledging what's happening. But yeah, self regulating, like I was talking about earlier, like if you're in these arguments, finding ways, whether it's through a break or taking deep breaths or whatever you can do to like manage your own emotions in those moments are important. Quality time, like I said, prioritizing the relationship is important. Those are the main ones. And I think the couples that come in to see me are already kind of a step ahead because they've acknowledged that there's a problem and that they're both on board to doing something about it.
Mm, that's so true. Okay, so we're going back to that main point, which is healthy couples are engaged and working hard to heal and they're on each other's team. And you mentioned a slew of other things that makes couples healthy. Now, can you read this when you meet couples like outside a therapy office? Like, can you tell what are the things you can see without your therapist cap on necessarily, but like out in the world where you think to yourself, this couple seems to be pretty well adjusted, pretty healthy. What are you looking for there?
I think that's a bit harder to interpret because when people come into therapy, they're talking about their issues, and out in the world, you're not really talking about those things. But there are small things that you can see, like in the way that they treat each other, that is a good sign, such as, you know, just always thinking about the other person, like, hey, I'm going to the bar or something. Do you want a drink also? Saving a spot for them, just anything that signifies that their partner is presently on their mind.
So that consideration piece is what I think of when you're saying those things, like someone who's considerate.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I think it does come back to consideration and mindfulness of the other person. not to the point where they're totally not thinking about themselves, like everything is about balance. But, when I see that in other couples, that seems like things are probably going well for them.
And I think I could understand why you don't want someone who's just losing themselves or forgetting themselves in a relationship too. What are the signs that's happening?
Yeah, that kind of goes back to codependency. The signs I would say is when you're having trouble getting in touch with your own emotions and you're thinking about your partner's emotions first, or you feel responsible for their emotions. That can be a red flag. I think it's important for couples to have a reasonable amount of distance from each other, like having their separate lives, like separate friends, uh, like having different jobs, stuff like that is really important because it can all get kind of meshed together sometimes. But I think the biggest thing for codependent couples is boundaries.
Mm. So, can you explain what codependency is? That is a word that took me so long to figure out because I think people throw it around all the time. And the word itself seems like it would mean one thing, but it actually means another thing. So, could you kind of explain what it means for people?
Yeah. So another way of phrasing that would be enmeshed. And basically, the way that I think about it is, like I said, the boundaries just aren't there. Or maybe they're there, but there's like gaps in between them. They're not strong enough. So an enmeshed or a codependent couple tends to be, like I said, they're thinking about their partner's emotions over their own. They're feeling responsible for how their partner feels, even when they're not to blame for stuff. Just kind of not feeling like a full independent person within the relationship.
Mhm, mhm. And what about the other person in that situation? Are they the same way? Are they more self-centered?
Codependent couple, there's probably both that way. What I think you're talking about is more of an attachment issue. Like if someone is anxiously attached and is pulling the other person in when they don't want to be pulled in, that's not necessarily codependency. That's just sort of an anxious attachment style.
Okay, okay. Got it. So in codependency, a lot of the times both people are blurred boundaries, losing their sense of self, putting the emotions and feelings of the other person before their own. In my mind, and I think this is why it was always so hard to put a finger on, I always thought codependency was one person is that way, the other person's maybe considered a quote narcissist. And I know that's another word that's thrown around a lot out in the world, maybe not even used correctly.
Yeah, I hear that word all the time. And I think it is overused. And sometimes I think that word can be used to like diminish the other person in a way. Like if it's a couple and they're calling one of them a narcissist, that's not conducive to healthy communication. So going back to dependency or codependency, one of the hallmarks to that too is feeling guilty for having your own feelings. There's a lot of guilt tied up in emotions and feeling like a separate person and those sorts of things.
Okay, got guilt. Interesting. I feel like a lot of people in my audience would be having their ears perked up with this codependency piece, just because I know my listeners.
Yeah.
Uh, so what do you suggest? Like, how do you start to like break free from that pattern of not really prioritizing yourself or losing yourself in a relationship?
Yeah. I think it starts with setting those boundaries, like making those more clear, creating more space for yourself to have a life outside of the relationship, and making sure that both of you guys are prioritizing that because it should come from both sides. And I think when you start to do that is when it starts to become easier to make sense of your own emotions because the blurredness between them are starting to separate.
Mhm. Okay. Yes. So trying to find that almost line, not line. I don't want to make it sound like division, but it's like finding what makes you you and what makes you different from the other person and owning that, being okay with that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Okay. Wonderful. So That's all really helpful information. I guess as far as thinking about our listeners, maybe there are listeners here who are wanting to rebuild their relationship. Maybe it's not in a good place for one reason or another. What skills do you suggest they start to hone or build so that they can do the work to get their relationship back into a better place?
Taking a moment to sit down and think about what's missing on my side and on my partner's side. Like, how are we kind of missing each other throughout all of this? What are the issues that have led to this? I think kind of building a timeline helps people zoom out a bit and see when things went wrong or like how they went wrong over time. I think that can be really helpful. But yeah, once you have, the most important thing is just figuring out what needs to change, and then you can start working on that. But just generally, I think kind of using those four antidotes, especially when talking about difficult topics, are important. And making sure that you're saying what you need to say, getting that off your chest, and you're both hearing each other.
Yeah. Okay, I love that. So I think what's interesting to me is you mentioned expressing yourself fully, discovering what the needs are, but then also this timeline. Why do you suggest a timeline is something people should consider? Like, I assume it's something they could map out at home.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of something that I do in session is, in order for me, an outsider, to learn about the relationship, it's helpful to know, like, when did things start to change? Likely it probably wasn't always this way, or else you probably wouldn't be with that person in the beginning. So maybe there were moments where things shifted. There were like we were talking about earlier, those moments like infidelity or just breaches of trust, maybe not that extreme, that have happened that have led to a distance between both members. But I think it would be a good exercise for each member of the couple to do that and see how it's different or similar to their partner.
Mm. So, wow, that would be pretty eye-opening, right? It's like I feel like I've heard someone refer to this as like just like looking for the points of rupture in a relationship and seeing like where things started to change. How did dynamic shifts? How did you feel from that point onward? And I assume some people carry those like moments of hurt and pain with them way too long.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, sometimes it makes sense to hold on to that. Like maybe there hasn't been a moment where it's felt right to reapproach it. But I think in order to be honest and like open with your partner, it's important to like vocalize these things, like say how you've been hurt. And then again, that kind of opens the door for them to respond to you in a helpful way.
And I'm sure keeping in mind that calm, cool, collected, gentle approach you were talking about before is important because I think I can imagine people going into a relationship where they want to express how they've been hurt and actually being really attacking about it. How do people get to a place where they're feeling calm and collected while expressing something really painful to their partner?
Yeah. I mean, I don't think you have to necessarily be calm and collected. I think it's just about
Or the gentle approach.
right. It's about the gentleness, the words that you use, making sure, like I said, that there's not like full on blame towards one party or the other. But blame is different than saying like, this is what happened and this is how I felt hurt, rather than you hurt me and, I'm still dealing with this sort of thing. You know, kind of using those I statements is what Gottman says to do. Like, here's how I'm feeling versus here's what you've done to me. Because that can, like you said, feel like an attack.
Okay, so the phrasing can be centered with I statements, less finger pointing, less blaming. That makes a lot of sense. So, what would a gentle approach sort of sound like versus maybe an aggressive approach? Say someone was really hurt by something that happened a year ago. What would that approach sound like? Like aggressive versus gentle?
Yeah. So aggressive would be something like, You asked me the other day if we could hike to the top of this mountain, and you knew that my foot was hurting, and you knew I've been dealing with this pain for a while now, and you didn't even think about this. So that would be kind of aggressive. Maybe it would look more extreme than that. But the softer approach would be, hey, the other day you mentioned or you suggested that we hike to the top of this mountain, and that was hurtful to me because you knew that this has been an issue for me for a while, and it hurt my feelings that you didn't think about that.
So what are the differences there, you would say? They're not extremes, right? Those are two very subtle. I can hear people being like, I don't see a huge difference between those. So what's the difference?
I think that's what does make it difficult is that it is very subtle, but it's really about, in the first example, it's about here's how you didn't think of me. Like you hurt me rather than I'm feeling hurt because you didn't think of me this way. It's about starting with yourself and how you're feeling and not automatically coming out of the gate with the blame and the finger pointing and the you did this sort of thing.
Got it. Thank you for sharing that. I think the nuance there is important. I know that there's so many people who think they are being gentle, but there's actually a little bit of aggression mixed in because there's lack of education or awareness around how to communicate. It's so hard and it doesn't come naturally to a lot of people when they're feeling intense emotions to slip into that kind of gentle approach that you were talking about.
I think it's difficult because the way that I view it is when people have been hurt, the first thing that they do is go into defensiveness and attacking and reactivity towards another person. But I think really like digging deeper beneath that, it's about the hurt and the pain. People are going to be more receptive to someone that's hurting and asking for help versus someone who's coming at them with anger. I think especially women tend to shut down when someone is yelling or their voice is raised or you can just hear the anger in the tone. Like, I know sometimes it's not possible to remove that, but if it is possible to sit with that anger for a bit and get to the root of it versus reacting with that anger.
I think that's really helpful. Anger is such an interesting emotion. I know that for me, and I've started noticing my relationship with anger. I notice that, and it comes out in relationships sometimes, right? Like when I'm angry, it's usually because I'm scared about something underneath. Like I'm scared about the outcome of something, or I'm scared about the safety of a situation. And so I turn into that angry version of myself. But deep down, there's something underneath it, whether it's hurt or fear. So anyone listening to this, it's so helpful. Like just notice when you're feeling angry and ask yourself, what's the emotion underneath?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think even just sitting with that for a few minutes, like just seeing like, okay, what's actually going on here? Why am I feeling this way? And kind of getting logical with it almost. Like it's about having that external perspective, looking down and saying, what's going on here? And then that can help people to actually dig deeper. Maybe that brings out some other emotions that you didn't even know were there.
Yeah, that's really a cool way to think about it. I've never thought of emotions as looking at them from a logical perspective.
Right. Yeah, it's easier
Like
said than done.
emotions can be totally illogical, but like at the end of the day, maybe you do want to put a more logical like lens of the world on and being like, okay, what caused me to feel this way? Why am I feeling this way? It doesn't have to be this huge upheaval of all of your emotions. It doesn't have to be so difficult if you kind of keep it in that frame of mind.
Yeah, and another way of thinking about that is like imagine you're watching it on a TV screen. Like you're not the person in the situation, but you're the person that's watching it. So you can still feel that emotion, but you can also kind of see it from that external perspective. And I think that's what like tuning into that is really helpful. Just saying, if I were outside of this situation, how would I feel and interpret this?
Got it. So when you kind of take that step back, it's easier to think clearly in a way.
Yeah, and I mean, of course, you're still going to feel emotional about it. Like, that's not a bad thing. And I think that's actually helpful. Like, your emotions can lead you to where you're actually feeling hurt. Just about creating space for it, allowing it to be there, especially if it's something really intense, having that external perspective, like taking a step back would be good.
Mm, love that. So I guess to wrap things up, this is a random question I just thought of, but like bringing it back to the idea of healthy relationships, what is something someone listening to this show can do today to help their partner feel good or happy in their relationship? Is there anything you do as a therapist that gets couples feeling better in a positive mindset around their lives together?
Yeah, there's a few things that come to mind. This can be difficult if you're like going through it, like if things are really tough right now, but writing a list of like the things that you're grateful for your partner. Like, what do you appreciate about them? What do you love about them? It's important to like get tuned back into that because that's why you're really here, right? So it's important to get back there. Also, increasing non-sexual touch, like hugging, you know, kissing for a few seconds, cuddling, things like that. Really, it's kind of like medicine sometimes. I think people don't realize that they're missing it until they get back into it. Yeah. So I think those two things would be really good. But also, like we were talking about, like the quality time, making sure that you have like even like 1 hour a week of no screens, literally sitting together or talking or playing a card game, something that can be really inexpensive but really valuable for the relationship.
Mm. Oh man, I just feel better thinking about those things because they're just like easy things people can do to feel better together. And I love that. So thank you so much for sharing that. And for people who are interested in learning more about your work or potentially working with you, how can they find you?
Yeah, so I work with Red Willow Counseling and Recovery. I have a profile on their website. I also have an Instagram page called Renewal by Jules, all one word. I also have a Psychology Today page. So if you just look up my name, I come up. I work in person in Park City, but also via telehealth throughout Utah.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much, Juliana, or should I say Jules, for this lovely interview. I'm sure people have learned so much, and I'm hoping everyone feels inspired to make a positive change to restore or heal the relationship that they're in. And yeah, thank you. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for having me.